Washington Journal continues.
Daniel Ellsberg, how many times have you been in jail in the last week?
In the last week, 2.
Why?
Really, I think jail going, which Gandhi said he invented, but he really invented mass jail going, as we saw, by the way, in New York the other day, was invented by Henry David Thoreau in a war very like this one, an aggressive war by the United States, and he said that that was the Mexican War. And he said that it was a way of demonstrating, I think, that you were casting your whole vote, not a strip of paper merely, but your whole influence, clogging by the weight of your own resistance what was going on. Now, an individual can't do that. Even 100, 200 people can't do that. But what they can say is that what their country is doing, the country they love, is doing something wrong, deeply wrong. I think it brings out the moral, the fact that people are willing to experience some inconvenience in their own person, conveys the message that it's a serious crisis, and that people should focus on it as something where they should consider doing something out of the ordinary, being willing to pay a personal price in their own careers, their own relationships with other people, in order to demonstrate that there's a moral dimension to what's going on, as well as a practical, and that people should wake up to their own consciences and change what they're doing.
Bill Kristol, when you hear this, what's your reaction?
Well, I respect peaceful civil disobedience, so I strongly disagree with Mr. Ellsberg about the morality of the war. I think this is actually both a necessary and a just war, a moral war of liberation of the Iraqi people. But obviously, some people disagree, and this is a great country. They can express their disagreements.
How long ago did you come to the point of view that you have about this war? You remember?
About the
before the
war.
Need to go in.
Yeah. No, I was unhappy in 1991 when we stopped the war and left this brutal tyrant in power. I think we betrayed the people who rose up against Saddam, a genuine popular uprising after we correctly threw him out of Kuwait and repelled his aggression. That was a big mistake, I think, on the part of the Bush administration, in which I served, the first Bush administration, a political mistake and a moral mistake. I've thought ever since that it would be great to liberate Iraq. I hoped we could do it peacefully, as many people did, and we tried with sanctions and inspections and political pressure on Saddam. That ended up not working. The inspection regime fell apart. He went ahead with weapons of mass destruction. I think we had no choice.
Is there any way you would support
Could I comment on that?
Sure.
Yeah, I can support a lot of what he said, actually, just now. In fact, I agree with you, and I was looking at your book just yesterday, where you were really quite critical, and I agree with you on the policy which you've just described of the Bush administration of not just standing by for a genuine popular uprising among the Shiites in the south and the Kurds in the north that had a real chance of succeeding, but actually really departing from our own armistice agreements, not enforcing a no-fly zone, which you could have done very easily with no loss of American life, and not supporting the rebellions, which again we had every right to do and could have done. Which is to say, by the way, that that was not an ordinary error. It really resulted in Saddam's being there today. One would have to say, I'd forgotten, frankly, that you were part of that administration. But, and I'm not holding you, obviously, accountable for that policy with which you disagreed. It does raise the question in my mind, since that was really wrong. And by the way, I thought that was wrong at the time. I was appalled by my country, my president, who was Bush at the time. I hadn't voted for him. I did support the opposition to aggression in Kuwait. Again, we agree on that, very much so. I was not anxious to see the U.S. invade Baghdad, toward Baghdad as it's doing now. I didn't want to find out if we would be welcomed as liberators in our role of foreign invaders. I didn't want to find out the uncertainty, answer the uncertainty which we're now encountering of whether the regular army or the Republican Guard would fight in their own country better than they fought in a country they'd invaded. So I perhaps disagreed with you on that point. But on the point that we could have supported and at least stopped Saddam from killing 30 to 60,000 people under President Bush, from killing these people who were revolting. I thought that was not just an error, it was deeply wrong. And I would raise the question to you, you in the administration, what did you consider doing? You were in the position I was in 65 and 66 and 67, and for that matter, 69, watching your government do something that you thought was not just pragmatically mistaken, but really wrong. We were keeping Saddam in power by choice of American power. That's why he's there today. Did you consider doing something more than disagree? Perhaps putting out the word of your dissent? Perhaps resigning with documents and revealing those to the press and to the Congress, your own disagreement and the underlying estimates? I can imagine that you might not have. Certainly I didn't when I should have in '64, but did you?
I had no documents to put out. There were no secrets about the president's policy.
Vice President Quayle didn't have
Vice President Quayle, I
access?
believe, raised. Well, there were no secret documents. The president's policy of not,
Were there
of
not
not
estimates
not going to Baghdad and not supporting the rebellion when it happened was a totally public policy, and there was very little support for a much more aggressive American policy at the time.
Did you write memos?
There were a few people in the administration who weighed in. I think the vice president raised the issue. Certainly, Paul Wolfowitz, we now know, raised the issue at the time within the Defense Department. People like Paul Wolfowitz and I were not in a position, frankly, to get our case heard terribly well, and we made our case and didn't. I made a case for intervening in the Balkans later in 1991, and that, of course, went nowhere either. Look, I don't think these were simply immoral decisions by the president. These were judgment calls. There were reasons. There were arguments.
They weren't simply, but they were immoral.
Well, no, that's not so easy to call a political decision immoral in this case. These were judgments. These were judgments. These were judgments call. These were judgment calls, and there were arguments, serious arguments that we didn't want to try to occupy Baghdad, that the rebellion would have failed anyway, we would have gotten in deeper.
I'm not talking about going to Baghdad. There were very practical judgments.
Well, no, that's what it would have meant.
How about supporting popular uprising? That was what it meant.
Supporting a popular uprising halfway and not going to Baghdad would have been the worst of all worlds. We would have gotten 200,000 people killed.
That's not what you say in your book. Pardon me, I'm having trouble with this.
No,
that's
but I mean,
not what you say in your book. What you say in your book was that we should have supported the popular uprisings, and that seems to me perfectly sensible.
To support a popular uprising against a tyrannical government, you have to be willing to go all the way and remove the tyrannical government.
No, you didn't.
It would be less moral. It would be less moral to encourage the uprising, as we did in Hungary in '56, and then leave them there after they've even been more encouraged?
We were in a position, as you say in your book, and I'm agreeing with you here, we were in a position to clear the skies of Saddam's armed helicopters.
And we should have done so.
We should have done so.
But it still might not
Those
have worked.
Were critical.
It still might not have made the rebellion succeed, and then we probably would have had to have gone to Baghdad, which I would have supported.
And we would have done it with the support of the Shiites,
which I would have
support of the Kurds, which we're not getting today. So now we have, we would have had it then. We're not getting today, in part because we did betray them at that time.
We're getting it today. We will get it today.
We will get it. You're sure of that?
Yeah.
How sure?
Yeah, well, I'm quite sure.
Weren't you just as sure a week ago? Didn't you expect more liberating phenomena? Where are the roses? Where are the greeting music?
Not particularly. Saddam's thugs are killing people who try to come out and greet Americans with roses. There are hundreds of thousands of Shia exiles. There are hundreds of thousands of Kurds. There's a free Kurdistan in the north of Iraq. I'm quite confident that the huge majority of the people of Iraq, and not just Kurds and Shia, but Sunni as well, will greet the liberation of Iraq. Good. Saddam is an unbelievably brutal dictator.
Your confidence explains your policy here, I would say. It makes more sense out of it. But what is your confidence of that based on?
That most human beings do not like being tyrannized by a brutal dictator who has killed hundreds of thousands of their own people, and who to this very day is using his thugs to shoot people who seek to surrender, who seek to welcome the American forces.
That's very understandable, and I share that belief. Most humans don't like it, and by all accounts, the people of Iraq, Shiites, Muslims, Sunni, Kurds, do not like the tyranny of Saddam Hussein, don't like Saddam Hussein. But it seems to me in your book and what I've heard elsewhere from you, you very much underestimate another very widespread factor, and that is an objection to foreign invaders coming in and determining the country, the politics of the country, and, by the way, a considerable distrust that the U.S. in the third world, such as this, will actually bring about democracy, a very well-justified distrust. The Kurds have every reason to believe, I think, that they will be betrayed again by the United States, as so often in the past. In fact, the spectacle of our inviting Turks in to this war earlier, trying to bribe them into it, could not have been reassuring to the Kurds. They've been under the Turks before.
I would make the opposite point. We've actually fought very hard and pressured the Turks very hard to stay out, and I think this time we should...
Was the $27 billion to keep them out, actually?
No, that was to use Turkey to launch a northern front, which would have made this war go faster and would have saved American and Iraqi lives. Yeah. That's a very different matter.
Okay,
look, I'm against betraying the Kurds. I don't quite understand. Is your point that
You're against what?
I'm against betraying the Kurds. And is your point, surely your point isn't that because we've betrayed them in the past, we should betray them this time.
Not that we should, just that we will.
We will not. We will not.
And here's why I believe so. The notion of democracy in Iraq, I'm for. I'm for, totally, and for other places too. I don't know where I'm against it, I would have to say. However, as anybody who knows the situation in Iraq better than I, and I'm new to it, seems to know, democracy in Iraq and a definite influence on integrity, I should say, an insistence on, quote, integrity, meaning no separatism, no partitioning, no even federation, are really in conflict. Democracy has a high chance, as I'm sure, as I've learned, just by studying the last 6 months only, democracy has a high chance of resulting in a Shiite majority government, which, since they comprise some 67% of the people there, and a Shiite government, whatever their current relations with Iran, has a chance of opening relations with Iran. We're not going to allow that.
This is a
We're not going to allow that.
This is a kind of ethnic and religious determinism that I
Determinism? I'm talking about U.S. policy.
Because human beings, Islamic human beings are Shia does not mean they're going to be pro-Iran. In fact,
no, but
millions of Iraqi Shia fought against Iran. And because human beings are Shia doesn't mean they're going to persecute Kurds.
But are we...
You could have a federated democracy in Iraq. Is it going to be easy? No. Was American democracy easy? No. But
I'm not against the democracy. I'm not against it. I'm making a prediction of U.S. policy, not of the way the Shiites
And your
behave.
prediction is what? That we will not support democracy?
My prediction is that the Kurds, a month ago, in the no-fly zone, had more autonomy and more democracy than they're likely to have under a government after our invasion, because we don't want we have promised the Turks that we will not allow an autonomous Kurdistan to be a magnet for their Kurds. So I think in deference to the Turks, despite their being difficult with us in the last month, I think the chances that the Kurds will have less freedom and less democracy, I'd say more confidently, not very confidently, more confidently that the U.S. will not allow a Shiite majority government which might open relations with Iran. I think why did we keep Saddam? Why did Bush Sr. keep Saddam? When you were in the administration, why did he keep Saddam in power then? Tell us why.
It's just not true.
Why did he make the
Iraqi
decision?
National Congress is a mixed group of Shia, Sunni, I think others, secular people.
Which this administration has said is not going to be running the government of Iraq.
No, but it's going to be an important part of the government of Iraq.
But can you tell me why they made the decision?
And I'm really distressed to hear that you somehow have this, as I say, this religious or ethnic determinist view that somehow what's wrong with a Shia majority government in Iraq?
Fine. It's fine with me. And it's fine with me if they actually separate from Iraq. I don't see the
Well, I
problem.
actually don't have any problem either with peaceful separation. And maybe 5 years from now
Fine.
we'll have a Czechoslovakia type situation. We helped liberate East Europe. They helped liberate themselves. It turns out the Czechs and the Slovaks decided not to keep Czechoslovakia together. That was fine. That was a much better outcome than
Let me not
being...
talk about future determinism, which neither of us, and I'm not a determinist. Let's talk about what the regime you served, why it made the decision you regard as a practical decision to support, in effect to support Saddam, to accept responsibility for his remaining in power. Why did they do that? You think
because
it was an
they
error?
had a mistaken,
Why the error?
They had a mistaken, there are several reasons. They had a mistaken view that it would contribute, that it weakened Saddam. They thought he would fall, as the president has said. They thought he would fall over time. They thought he would be so weakened that he would fall.
So why do it now with a popular uprising? That's not
why
a reason
do it now
for
to commit American troops?
Pardon me, it was not the issue, as you know very well. The issue was, do we keep their helicopters from flying? And we said to their helicopters, we allow them.
Is to use force.
Pardon me, not on the ground. You keep helicopters from flying.
Force in the air is also force.
Force in the air.
Force is American troops.
In the air.
So let's just be honest about this.
Yes.
Let's not, I mean, it's fine.
It would have involved American force.
If you're willing, well, thank you. Okay,
yeah,
good.
of course.
So.
But air power that we were authorized from every point of view to use. Okay. It was air power that would not be involved.
It could have used military power. It could have required ground forces. It could well have required ground forces. It would be irresponsible. You should be the first to say this, if I might say. It would be irresponsible to use air power in the prosecution of a military objective if you're not willing to go in with ground forces as well.
Strictly speaking, we had an agreement that they could not use air power within their country, perfectly reasonable after their aggression in Kuwait. All that we had to say was no air power.
Well, now you're the one who's so confident that's all we had to say.
Okay.
No responsible administration can act on that basis.
Right,
you have to be willing to go. If you're going to go help a popular uprising against a dictator, you have to be willing to go all the way. I would have supported it.
Pardon me. The alternative then is to do nothing and let them be slaughtered. That's... To do nothing and let them be slaughtered.
Yes,
60,000 be killed.
Well, I was not
That's more than we lost in Vietnam.
I was not a supporter of that, but yes, it would be more irresponsible to encourage further uprisings and let them get slaughtered.
Okay, the other part is that had we gone in on the ground, even at that point, we would have had with us then Shiites and Kurds fighting alongside,
which would have been good.
Is not the case now. Now, why is it not the case now?
That's just false. We have actually tens of thousands of Shia exiles, for example, have come back.
Exiles? outside the country. I'm talking
yes,
inside
people who
the country.
fled the country in 1991
That's
have
right.
come back to help contribute to the
And
liberation
I'm
of
afraid
Iraq.
that people who proposed this war have failed one lesson of intelligence history, which is not to rely too much on the knowledge of people who have left the country and been away for years in many cases, on what popular feelings inside the country. It's not that people inside the country love Saddam, but they may be the people who've come to this country, which is fine, may very well underestimate the desire of those people not to be governed by foreigners. So when I think that you're saying we're doing the liberation of Vietnam, that's not the feeling that our troops are getting right now.
Let me interrupt and tell our audience, if you're listening on radio, Daniel Ellsberg is one voice you're hearing, and Bill Kristol is the other voice. We're going to take calls for between now and the 10 o'clock hour on the East Coast. We go first to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You're on the air.
Hi. I want to start with a comment about our flag wavers from 9/11. Where are all they now? I mean, it's like back whenever we were bombed, and then it was popular to be patriotic, and everybody wanted to wave their flags. But when it's hard to be patriotic, when it takes making some stands and maybe making some choices, not everybody's going to like because you cannot please everyone, then it's not popular to be patriotic. And everybody keeps throwing up Vietnam, Vietnam, Vietnam. Well, you know what? Vietnam has nothing to do with this. Saddam Hussein was given 12 years to disarm, and that's what this is all about. We need to stick to the main subject. He would not disarm. He would not disarm. When are you going to make him disarm? It's not ever going to be a popular time to say, okay, it's enough. This is the time. It's just like your child. You tell them, next time you do that, next time you do that, next time you do that, then they start feeling like, well, you know what, you never mean what you say.
All right, caller, thanks. Let me take a call opposed to this war, and we'll then get you back in it. Go ahead, Redondo Beach, California. You're on the air.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wonder how we reconcile these views with how we treat the American Indians.
Is that all you want to say?
That's in total.
All right, thanks. Gentlemen? Mr. Kristol? Why don't you answer the last one?
Well, I'm for treating, I think the American Indians are now full citizens of America. We have injustices in our past in treating the American Indians, but I'm for equal rights for American Indians, and I'm for liberating the people of Iraq from this horrible tyranny. I don't really agree with the first caller. I don't think, in the sense that I think there's plenty of patriotism, and I think the American people understand that war is tough, and I think that though the administration was a little over-optimistic the first day or two, and hopeful, obviously, that we might secure a very quick victory, and it was a reasonable thing to try. And the media, in its usual way, oscillated up and down. The fact is the American people are patient and calm, and they understand that there will be casualties, and they understand that it could take a month or 2 months, not a week or 2 weeks. I myself have always warned against expecting this to be a cakewalk or some kind of easy thing. This is a brutal totalitarian dictatorship that Saddam has spent a lot of time implicating an awful lot of people in his crimes who are now going to fight for him to the death, especially the Fedayeen and the Special Republican Guards. These totalitarian dictatorships do not go down easy. The Germans knew Hitler was going to lose by March of 1945, and they fought strongly. Some of it's terror, some of it's fear, some of it's habit, some of it is a resistance to a foreign invader, which is certainly understandable. There's a kind of basic patriotism that rises up no matter how much you hate your own tyranny. But a lot of it is fear and terror of the regime, and I do think when the regime goes, it will crumble quickly. But in any case, I think the American people understand that this war was going to be a real war, and I think they're here for the course, and I actually am pretty confident in the patriotism of the American people.
Look, not to personalize this too much, but I do understand you as being one of a relatively small number of people who really promoted the idea of an invasion of Iraq for some time, going back, as you say, perhaps even to 1991. So I do recognize in that some underlying flawed attitudes, if I may say, that I was part of when I went to Vietnam. I went to Vietnam as a liberator and to promote democracy. I worked for retired CIA agent Major General Lansdale, whose mission was, with our small team, really to promote democracy as a goal, by the way, within the American administration, which was very dubious of the idea, and within Vietnam, to provide Vietnamese with some real alternative to the Stalinist tyranny which really lay behind what the Viet Cong were offering, what the Hanoi was offering. And that was a tyranny. It is a tyranny now. it was very hard, I think, for us and for French and others to estimate correctly the nationalist feelings of people who did not agree with that tyranny or and nevertheless did not want to be ruled by a foreign power. I think we're experiencing that right now. My guess, by the way, when I hear about the terror, I only used to read that stuff in the government about how the only thing that was keeping the resistance to us going was that the people were terrorized, were tortured, were terrorized by their communist-led forces, which was true, by the way, they were, but that was the only factor. I not only read that, I wrote that in speeches, and I believed it in my ignorance. I'd been in the Marines, but I hadn't been in a war at that point. And it really took a while over there to realize that when people, as they did then, live in tunnels and under the U.S. bombing, under heavy U.S. bombing, or I would say right now, by inference, the Fedayeen we're seeing right now behind the lines.
Do you believe that most people in South Vietnam preferred the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong to the corrupt government of South Vietnam?
No, I didn't then, and I don't now.
Right, so
what I did come to realize was that they did not want to be at war, and that we were the ones essentially imposing that war on them, and that they did not want to be ruled by foreigners. I think you greatly, as I understand, you supported the war to
500,000 of them
end.
did not. I mean, they did not want to be ruled by a North Vietnamese tyranny either.
Have
and half a million of them left South Vietnam.
Have you been to Vietnam?
No. Half a million of them, and I know many people who left Vietnam, and half a million of them left at horrible sacrifice to their own lives. Not because America was taking over Vietnam, but because the North Vietnamese government was taking over Vietnam.
I only wanted to make a military political point, a narrow one, which is this. It's very unwise, as I did, and many other people who did their working for the government. My role was counter-terrorism. My role was counterinsurgency. I was a professional at it for a while. Started without knowing much, but that was what I was doing, and I was working with military men and political men doing it. We came to realize eventually, and it didn't come very fast, that the convenient notion that the people who seemed not to be cooperating with us, the people who were not helping us with information, were refraining from that not just because they were terrorized. It's true, they were threatened.
But let me just make
because they recognized the nationalism of the people fighting against them. They fought against what they saw as foreign occupation of their country. People have this strange, I would even agree with you.
They didn't fight against, you just said the majority of South Vietnamese fought with us against the North Vietnamese.
I didn't say that at all.
Or supported us
No,
against
quite
the North
not. I
Vietnamese.
didn't say either of those. You asked me whether they preferred the North Vietnamese. And I said no, they would have preferred not to be ruled by either of those groups, as a matter of fact, either the communist-led people or our essential puppets who had fought against the independence of the country. They would like other leaders altogether, but that was not the choice we offered them. We never offered real democracy in that country for a moment. The question was, would they inform against them, or would they allow their sons to go into the hills and fight against us? The Fedayeen, I want to be very precise right now, to think that the Fedayeen, who are coming behind U.S. lines, getting in between U.S. units in sandstorms, and I've seen my old battalion there, 3-2, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, around Nasiriyah on the film. I get to see them in this horrible dust. And out of that dust, as they see, these people keep popping up behind them and around them, and you don't know where they're coming from, fighting in that. Both sides fighting very bravely. To think that the people who are fighting against our Marines are doing it only because someone has a pistol to their heads is very foolish.
Sure, there are a couple of thousand of Fedayeen who are thugs and murderers. They are the SS of Saddam's regime. These are not...
You know who the Fedayeen are?
Yes, they are the SS. They are personally handpicked by Saddam. The Fedayeen Saddam, there are a few thousand of them. They are murderers. It's like saying that the German people were, very upset because the SS are bravely fighting behind American lines in March 1945.
Listen, I just heard
Whatever else you could say about this war, let me just make one point. George Bush is not fighting this like Vietnam. We don't need to re-fight the whole history of Vietnam.
Maybe, that's the danger.
But it's not going to happen.
Let me take
it's
a
not
call
going to happen. This is going to be a 2-month war, not a
Park Hill.
It's going to be 2 months,
ahead,
not
please.
6 months.
Hey, Brian, how's it going?
Good, sir. What would you like to say?
Well, I think it should be pointed out that the real next Vietnam is in South America, not over in Iraq, like a lot of the pseudo-intellectuals from the left would have us believe. Mr. Ellsberg, I was in Nam, and those people didn't want to be ruled by North Vietnam.
I agree.
Regardless of the impression or what you people from the left try to
Pardon me, I've just said that. I've just said that several times myself.
No, it's my time, and I've been waiting for 20 minutes, please. I want you to know, sir, that there was actually at a time when I was heavily self-medicating myself when I actually thought about executing you after the release of the papers there. And the reason why is because a lot of American kids died because of those papers. The morale that hit bottom in the service, the damage that it did to American psyche that resulted in marches and spreading a crowd across Africa, that resulted that in famines and genocide that is still taking place here in the 21st century. Now, let's get a couple of truths here about Iraq, first off, that we keep getting thrown out. People will say, well, Iraq never attacked us. Well, that's bull. They have attacked us when we've been attacked in the no-fly zone. I'd like to ask those supporters of Clinton who call in here talking about this, who did Kosovo attack? What Americans did Kosovo attack? As far as if it really is our fault, as liberals like to say, that Saddam is there, then isn't it our responsibility to take him out?
Thanks. Let me ask both of you a couple questions about what were your positions on going into Bosnia or going into Kosovo?
I supported going into both and thought the Clinton administration was slow in Bosnia. I thought the Bush administration really failed in 1991, 1992 to nip Milosevic's ethnic cleansing at the beginning. But I supported intervention in both Bosnia and Kosovo.
What was your position?
I think one where we may really disagree is that, if I recall, you supported with Senator McCain the idea of putting troops into Serbia. I certainly, after Vietnam, opposed that very strongly, not because Serbia obviously was a tyrannous dictatorship at that point that had committed many crimes. I did not want to find out whether how much the Serbs of this period differed from the Serbs who fought off 10 German divisions during the Second World War, held them down, and eventually liberated the country. People said, oh, they're different people, they're thugs, they're murderers, they'll fold right away. We didn't find that out, and I'm glad we didn't find that out. And I didn't really want to find out how people would fight for Saddam's regime back in '91. As I say, I was for supporting popular uprisings, and if we could have gone in with the support of most of the population, I would have supported that.
Columbia, South Carolina, go ahead, please. You're on with Daniel Ellsberg and Bill Kristol. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to start with a couple of premises that I think both speakers will agree on, which is, one, war is killing of innocents, and two, that is morally repugnant and we shouldn't do it if there is any way to avoid it. And it seems to me then there are two good reasons to go to war, and I really cannot think of others. One is someone has done something horrible to you or is really on the verge of doing something horrible to you. Or two is someone is doing something really horrible to someone else, like right now. They're doing it. They're massacring people. They're killing people. They're raping women. And we can help. So let's go in and help, just because they're the big bullies and they're really massacring people. And it seems to me neither of these situations is happening here. So this is a war that we really chose to go into, not because of moral reasons. And it seems to me the big flaw of the anti-war protesters is that they have framed the arguments as if somehow this war is wrong because it will cost too much, or because it will make people hate us, or because, all those practical considerations, when for me, the calculus is simpler than that. It's more basic, it's philosophical, it's moral. You do not go into war when you don't have to.
Bill Kristol.
Well, I let Dan Ellsberg comment on whether the anti-war protesters have been making the right arguments or not. No, look, I think it's a war of necessity and a just war. Murder is the killing of innocents. War is what states do when they have to either defend themselves by the use of force, primarily, obviously, when they have to defend themselves by the use of force, but it can also be justified, I think, to help liberate other people who are being brutally tyrannized by a regime like Saddam's, and I think that's what we're doing in this case.
She said that two reasons to go to war: one, that they've done something horrible to you, or that they're massacring people. Now you go in to stop it. Do you think either one of those has happened?
Well, the second, certainly over the last 10, 20 years, it does obtain with Saddam. There aren't many worse regimes in the world, and massacre is not a bad word for what he's done to his own citizens. But that by itself, you could argue, well, there are other dictators in the world and we don't want to be intervening. We can't intervene everywhere to liberate people, though we probably should intervene some places to liberate people. Probably should have intervened in Rwanda, where there was a massacre that had no relation to our direct national interests or safety. But on the first instance, there is an issue of the 18 UN resolutions, weapons of mass destruction, et cetera, and I think we absolutely had the right and I think the obligation to go in before Saddam could further develop his weapons of mass destruction.
Well, the listeners raised really very fundamental questions. Obviously, she's not speaking from the point of view of a total pacifist. I'm not one, she's not one, and Bill is not one. And consider that there are occasions when military action is required, and she gave the main one, where we don't even need the UN, where any country has the right to defend itself against direct attack. And that obviously does not apply here since Saddam. There's no evidence whatever that he was the attacker on 9/11 or involved in that, or was about to do another one. So we're to the other category of actions. And there, I would say the listener was a little imprecise. When you just say that people are doing terrible things, that opens the door very widely. People do terrible things, and I would disagree with Bill here on the scale of Saddam Hussein, except for his blatant aggression, which was unusual against Kuwait. But in terms of his torture, his tyranny, unfortunately, there are a great many torturing tyrannous regimes in the world. Some of them we've installed and support to this day, some we didn't. But as you say, we can't take care of all of them. The fact is that if you to decide whether actual war is justified, whether war is not a greater evil than the tyranny you're confronting, is something that nations are given to deceive themselves about. They don't like the regime next door. There, the UN Charter makes it very clear that where there's not a case of self-defense, then the decision is not to be made by any one single country as to whether another regime is committing crimes so great that it must go in. The UN Charter, which we ratified and is the highest law of the land, prudentially, I would say, says that it must be the agreement of the UN Security Council to decide that the threat to humanity or the threat to peace is so great we go in. We have not convinced a majority of the Security Council in this case that war is justified, and I think rightly so, that the cost, the judgment there is very clearly that the cost will impose on the people of Iraq by this war, assuming that it is not a 1 or 2 day affair, and that's already behind us. Bill is offering us a 2-month war with some assurance. What would be too much? What would be too many civilians killed to make him even agree that this was not justified? 5 or 6 months, how many civilians have to die?
Port Allen, Louisiana, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. I just have a little comment basically about what's going on in New York and San Francisco about these people marching and picketing, and they have every right to do so, but at a time like this when there's possible terrorists in this country, you know, willing to strike us at any time, we have no idea when, and they're tying up our government's resources just so they can go up and, you know, make arrests by the thousands of people who obviously don't care about what happened to the Kurds and the Shiites. And it seems to me that they're not thinking about what's going on. They think that this war is unjust, but there's a dictator who's shown his willingness to attack innocent people, and we have to do something about it. Just because we didn't do it in 91 doesn't make it, you know, okay to back off now.
Thanks. Go back to his comment about the UN. Mr. Ellsberg was saying, I mean, do you disagree with this?
Yeah, we can't be parallel because the Chinese, the dictators of China, or the French government has commercial interests and they don't want us to go to war. We're not going to go to war. What about Rwanda? The UN took possession of Rwanda. 800,000 people were slaughtered. Should we not have gone to Rwanda contrary to the UN action?
Pardon me. Bill, you really slide over that in this book. By the way, I wish I had my book up there too at the same time. It wasn't that long ago.
We haven't shown anybody either book, but we will show people.
Oh, I don't insist you put it on top of his.
Yeah,
That's great. Okay.
That's the Daniel Ellsberg book, and that's the
shuffled
Bill
cards.
Kristol book.
Daniel Ellsberg's book is much thicker.
That's right. So you can go. Rwanda is a very good case. In your book, which I was looking through, I noticed that you implied that it was the UN, or that we should have intervened, or the UN should have intervened, and slid over the fact that it was in fact the U.S. position that was crucial in preventing the UN to intervene. We lobbied very hard against the UN intervention our government, and this was a democratic government, refused to define that situation as genocide when it was as classic a case of genocide as one could find, because otherwise it would be hard for them to argue against doing it. Apparently the reason for that was that what they read as the domestic political reaction to Somalia kept them, a very different situation, kept them from allowing the UN to use the forces on the spot to intervene there. Now, the commander of those forces, who is not American, has written, and in fact, I believe resigned over the issue, but anyway, has written with great anguish. He expected the UN to authorize him. He recommended the UN authorize him, and it was strictly the U.S. who said no, because we, the U.S., might be drawn into it. Initially, they wouldn't even have been part of it. I think that was terrible U.S. policy, really terrible. Clinton essentially apologized for it later, but apology is a bit dim after the fact. So there you have a case where I would totally agree with you, except that it could and should have been a UN action. And it was the U.S. unilateralism, you might say, that prevented that.
Well, I think it would have been just whether or not done under the umbrella of the UN.
Your point is that we could have gone in on our own, but that again raises the specter we're facing now. The world looking at a power that thinks that it can arrogate to itself, without anyone else agreeing, the right of deciding when and where to invade someone or to bomb something. That would be a contrary principle.
Got to go to Philadelphia. Good morning, Philadelphia.
Good morning. Thank you very much for this forum, and I want to thank you, Mr. Ellsberg. I hope I'm saying your name right, because I've been listening to you for all of about a week, and I absolutely love most everything you're saying. You're informed. You're my voice. Thank you for being there. My argument is the first caller about the Vietnam thing. I believe if we do not learn from our past, we're doomed to repeat it. And what I will not do is go against my troops, my soldiers, those young men and women that are fighting for this country. They will not feel the way the vets from the Vietnam War felt from me. But I do not support my president, and I do not support this war. And it's so difficult to be me right now, because I really support the troops and love the troops and pray to God that they all get back here. But I don't support this president and his rapid-fire decision to not even wait until the UN came to a conclusion, which I believe he thought they weren't going to go his way, so he said, hurry up, let's do this.
Let's go to Allen, Kentucky next, and we'll get to our guest. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. My biggest fear, and first of all, I support the war, support the president. I truly support our troops. I've got a 15-year-old son here that's very concerned about this war, and I worry about all the kids that age in the future that's going to have to come up against this. If we don't do anything now, then it's going to come up later. I respect the older gentleman there that said he was a Marine, and I would like to know, did he volunteer or was he drafted during his Marine stay?
Thanks.
Answer that? Well, thank you. The answer to that is that I was deferred during the Korean War for a year to finish Harvard and then for another year of graduate school. And having been deferred and without any military inclination at all, I did feel someone else had gone in my place and it was my duty to go in. So I did volunteer then and went into OCs as soon as they were able to take me. I found actually beyond that, I was patriotic, I was a Cold Warrior, I was anti-communist and remained. I still am patriotic and anti-communist if it comes to that. And when I was in the Marines, I found out that I had more talent for it than I'd ever expected and more enjoyment. I liked military men, I loved the Marines, I still do. And look back on that. In the battalion that I was in, I had the honor of being a company commander. As a first lieutenant, I was the only one in the division at that time who had a company. I was due to get out in '56, but it was my battalion, which is now in Nasiriyah, I believe, still fighting. I just read this morning an officer there saying this was supposed to be over in 6 hours, and we've been fighting around the clock for 5 days now. So I sympathize with them very much. I empathize. I'm there with them, if you like, at my age. When they went to the Mediterranean, I was due to get out. I cabled the Commandant of the Marine Corps and asked to stay in the Marine Corps. until the end of that tour because there was likely to be war in the Middle East, as there was, the Suez Crisis in 1956. So I turned down a fellowship that I had at Harvard. I did get it back eventually with no assurance that I would, but I turned it down that I was about to embark on and went with my Marines because I'd been the training officer of that battalion. I'd had a company, I'd been head of several platoons in it, and I couldn't stand the thought that they would be in combat, as they nearly were. We were bombed by the British and French to some extent, but we didn't actually get into combat. And I would be watching from Harvard. I didn't want to do that. Then eventually, when Vietnam came, and we were in Vietnam, I was now a civilian. I'd stayed in the Marine Reserve for some years, but I was now a civilian. And when the war actually started, I volunteered to go to Vietnam as part of General Lansdale's team. I transferred to the State Department. And it turned out when I was there evaluating pacification in the field, which involved military actions, I used my Marine training, which was not shared by most people of my age at that time. I was younger than some and older than some. I was 35, 36, 37. I went into the field with Vietnamese troops and with American troops, soldiers and Marines, saw them fighting very bravely there. I was under fire with them. I felt confident doing that because I had had very good Marine training, and I'd given good Marine training. So if that answers your question, I identify very much then and now with military men, and especially with the troops, and especially with infantry troops. And in answer to the first comment by the other speaker, the other listener, do I support the troops? 100%, 100%. And there's no contradiction between supporting the troops, as I say, I walked with them in Vietnam, and feeling that the policy is deeply wrong and that the best support you can get for the troops is would have been to avert this war and keep them home.
Let me take a call. This one will be for Bill Kristol. We go to Ridgeview, Illinois. You're on the air.
Yes, sir. I was questioning the Bush administration's policies and negotiations, and if we had waited 12 years with little success, with little loss of life, to disarm Iraq, what would 12 more months have meant? And to go in with having world support. It seems the administration started the build-up prior to world support with no negotiations in mind. And some of their negotiations on other issues as far as the Coyote Treaty and the Defense Missile Treaty and the Middle East talks and oil shipments to Korea, seems like there's not much room for negotiations with this administration.
Thanks.
Well, I have no reason to believe we would have had any more support 12 months later than we would have had today, assuming even Saddam had done nothing in the intervening 12 months. The French were against this war. They disagree with us on it. They weren't going to change because we waited 12 months. So they had done nothing, incidentally, to get inspectors back into Iraq. The only reason we even had the UN process, the inspection process going, is that we had begun moving troops to the region. So I think the president waited plenty of time to see if Saddam was serious. He gave our friends and not so friendly nations at the UN plenty of time to see if they were serious about implementing Resolution 1441. And then he, I think correctly, decided that he had to go to war when the moment was right from a military point of view. We weren't going to sit there for 12 months as sitting ducks through a summer in the Arabian desert. But, you know, in a way, the previous caller asked what are the lessons of history we have to learn from our past. And I think this is where we fundamentally disagree, that I was, I'm younger than Daniel Ellsberg, and I was in junior high school and high school when he was having the experiences he had in Vietnam. But for me, in the last 12 years, since the end of the Cold War, the story has not been that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people have died, either Americans or non-Americans, because we have been too aggressive, too interventionist, too militaristic around the world. The story is the opposite. The story has been one of American timidity and weakness, beginning in '91 when we didn't help the uprising against Iraq, against Milosevic in '91, '92, in Rwanda, in the Balkans, against Saddam, against terror, against Osama bin Laden. Osama said, we're the weak horse. America's a weak horse. 19 casualties in Somalia, and we pull out. Lots of people have died because of the perception that we were the weak horse, including the 3,000, I think, on September 11th, 2001. And I do think, and therefore, I'm not so worried about America. America is not a very militaristic country. America's not going to run around the world cheerfully sending American boys and girls to fight ground wars everywhere. We're extremely reluctant to do that for good reason. In this case, there's such a serious threat. The president, I think, was right to do it. But again, the threat to world peace and order, the threat to a decent future, I think, is American weakness and timidity. not American strength. And what will the world look like 5 or 10 years from now if we're not willing to go in and deal with people like Saddam? What will the world look like with nuclear arms races in the Middle East and East Asia and dictators everywhere learning they can get weapons of mass destruction and deal with terrorist groups with impunity? That really, I think, is a nightmare world.
Clearwater, Florida, you're next.
Hi, good morning. Bill Kristol, I feel sorry for you today. You're talking to a gentleman next to you that is not willing to bend as much as a pencil. He's read his book basically on the air so far this morning. Every time that you ask him a question, he won't give you a yes or no. He goes on and on and on. Just yes or no, were you in Vietnam and how did you get there is all the man wanted to know. Were you drafted? Now, you asked Bill Kristol if he was in Vietnam. Were you ever in Baghdad, sir? I was in Baghdad 29 years ago. I know what goes on in that country. I try to go to Mosul, is the correct way of saying that name. The people there are in poverty. They don't know what the heck's good. They will not let you take pictures going from Baghdad to the ruins of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the wonders of the world that you travel to. I had guns pointed to my head, whether when I was in Baghdad or in Cairo. There's messes there. Those people are living in poverty, and this war is necessary. And my cousin has lost his life already for this war. And I don't give a damn about you being in Vietnam. There's other people. And that thick book that's in there is nothing but of riffraff that I've been hearing from you for this first 45 minutes of the show. And I hope to God that for the next 45 minutes your answers are cut shorter than what the hell they are right now.
Caller, why were you in Baghdad 29 years ago?
Actually, it was a confidential thing while I was there, and believe me, when you got ammunition pointed point blank to your head, I can't really talk about the things why I was there. But if I would ever sit down with you, sir, I would be more than happy to show you the pictures and tell you exactly what was going on there.
Thank you. Mr. Ellsberg.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because the point of short answers is indeed a sin of mine to go on too long, as my wife would sympathize, I'm sure, with that questioner. He mentions that he had a gun held to his head in Cairo also, which is, of course, another police state on our side at this moment. Pakistan, of course, is another Pakistan with its nuclear weapons. North Korea, a dictatorship with nuclear weapons. Now, unlike Saddam. China, a massive dictatorship with nuclear weapons. And the notion, would democracy in all of those countries be for the interests of them, the world, and ourselves? Yes. I would agree, I'm sure, with Bill Kristol on that point. Should we invade any of them or bomb any of them in order to bring that about? No. And to think that Iraq provided a good opportunity to do that, or a good excuse to do that, I think represented very poor wishful thinking by people who did not know that country. Certainly I am not one, but I was not suggesting that people go over there and bomb. And I think it reflected ignorance. By the way, I asked Mr. Kristol if he was in Vietnam, but the question is whether, and I did not accuse him of question of whether the draft, obviously he was too young for that war, and I certainly don't question his courage or patriotism, and I'm sure that with his views, which were like mine at the time, that he would have volunteered for that had he been older. The issue is experience here, and the question of when it is appropriate or necessary to go to war. And I do think that a lot of people are making choices. The people who support this war, very many of them are people who really don't have a very clear sense of what war actually involves. It's not only killing civilians, but it is killing civilians. It's a very serious matter. It's not just another instrument in the toolbox. I could agree with Mr. Kristol on many ways in which American pressure or American involvement, intervention, could have served and should have served to promote democracy. That hasn't been our aim in the Third World, not in Central America, not in Indonesia, not in many parts, or Egypt, or Pakistan. I don't recommend, I would oppose bombing any of those places, as we are now bombing, and I would oppose sending troops to any of those places. And I really asked Mr. Kristol which of those he would, and which tyranny and dictatorship in the world he would now, after Iraq. And I agree with you, the war will end eventually, whether it's 2 months or 8 months. But which would be next then?
Well, that is a prudential judgment. Look, Cairo, Egypt and Pakistan are authoritarian regimes. They're nothing like Saddam Hussein, just as a matter of...
Pakistan?
Nothing like Saddam Hussein.
Well,
Musharraf doesn't go around slaughtering tens of thousands of people.
How about North Korea?
North Korea is the other regime in the world that is as horrible.
Do you favor a military attack on North Korea?
I do not think you can take the military option off the table, but you cannot have the North Korean regime with a nuclear assembly line selling nuclear material to terrorists.
How do you get away? No, I think that, by the way, that is a real danger.
I think I would look
serious
hard,
danger.
and I would try to effect regime change in North Korea through peaceful and diplomatic pressures, economic pressures,
and if not,
pressuring China to open up the borders. I totally agree, incidentally, that our policy towards China has been unbelievably weak. I spent more time fighting the Clinton administration and the Republican Congress on China policy in the late 90s than I did on Iraq.
But are you in favor of bombing it and invading it?
No, but I am in favor in North Korea, therefore, probably of some form of embargo or quarantine, which requires military enforcement. And again, let's not kid ourselves that once you're beginning with military enforcement, you have to be willing to think through the consequences.
You have to there are distinctions to be made here.
I'm saying that, so I'm making distinctions. And so people who say that we hawks just want to bomb every place should allow us to make these distinctions. I would make, therefore, in the case of North Korea, what I would look at hard is a peaceful pressure for regime change, much more pressure on China to pressure North Korea, and it's going to the UN to try to get authority to interdict any export of any kind of weapons of mass destruction related material from North Korea to any terrorist group or other rogue state. We also need to be much tougher on Pakistan, because there has been an axis of evil, for all that everyone makes fun of Bush on this. There's been an axis of proliferation around the world, which is a rather limited number of regimes, including Pakistan, and there we've been much too soft on Pakistan.
Hold your thought just a second. Let me take a couple calls, because we got to get the folks in here. Let's go to Albuquerque, New Mexico. You're on the air.
I'd like to hear from both guests their comments regarding the current administration's blocking of what would otherwise be regularly scheduled release of decade-old presidential papers, and whether perhaps the real reason for the blocking of that release is that it might reveal to the American public something more about why the rest of the world is so skeptical about U.S. policies, and whether, in fact, U.S. policies are the source of so many problems in the Mideast. And that isn't the real reason underlying the blocking of release of presidential papers.
We'll get right back to that. Go to Hudson, New Hampshire. You're on the air.
Yes, first of all, I support this war entirely. I also support the anti-war demonstrators. I think the pro-war demonstrators should be out demonstrating much harder. I think every American should make it clear publicly what his stand is on this war. Now, my question.
Caller, let me just ask you a question. Why is it that there are more anti-war demonstrators out than pro-war, do you think?
I really think it goes back to the 60s that demonstrating against war is fun. For a lot of them, we got people that go to demonstrations to be at the demonstration. Let's go have a party. Let's go dress up strange and tick off the police. It's something to do. It's the in thing.
What's your question?
Okay, my question is, looking at the history of the Middle East, let's totally forget 9/11. Us in Europe developed the problem in the Middle East. We drew the lines just here and there of where countries were going to be. We've gone in and out of there. When it's convenient to be friendly, we're there. When it isn't, we desert. We've made a lot of enemies there. We built Saddam Hussein. As much as anyone in the world, us and the Europeans kept Saddam Hussein in power, kept Saddam Hussein alive. I think we have a moral obligation, since the man has turned out to be the South Asian equivalent of Stalin. His favorite reading appears to be Stalin's writings, that we owe it to that part of the world to get rid of him and help. And the important thing is that we follow through with the help to the Iraqis to build it into the type of country that Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, and Israel should all be. They could be a major center of economics and intellectual ability if they would just make that their goal instead of trying to prove who's toughest.
Daniel Ellsberg. Let me ask you first to deal with the presidential papers question.
Oh, okay. Forgotten that.
Both of you.
How could I forget that?
Yes. What is your feeling about the presidential papers?
I think there's every reason to believe that presidents, Democrat and Republican, who hold on to their papers, as President Nixon's heirs are still doing 30 years later. Most of his tapes have still not been released. Amazingly enough, 30 years later, I read some of them just last year that were very revealing. When we do get to look at them, the reason comes often very clear. It's not just that those things need not have been kept secret. From the point of view of the people keeping them secret, they did need to be, because they were embarrassing. They showed mistakes, errors, wrong forecasts, bad estimates, bad decision-making, or actual crimes.
Let me ask Bill Kristol on this issue, and then we'll come back to the other one because we're going to run out of time if we don't. What about your position on the presidential papers?
Yeah, I don't actually know much about, how old these papers are, but having served in government for 7 years, I don't know. Most there are plenty of wrong decisions made and plenty of incorrect analyses. That's government. I didn't see much. I certainly never saw much that had anything of the magnitude that Dan Ellsberg is referring to. There's no secret, for example, in first Bush administration's decision making. There's no secret that they misjudged the situation in Iraq.
Why hold them up
in early 1990? I honestly don't know. I really don't know much.
I think the reason has come
when
very
are the
clear.
papers from that are being held up?
Both the Reagan administration and the previous Bush administration.
The reason seems very obvious. The administration keeping them secret now very largely served in those historic, not very long ago administrations of Reagan and Bush, especially Reagan, actually. And so it's very self-serving of them not to want the public to see what might embarrass them right now in government.
Though it is
and when you say that you didn't see anything really very wrong, I'm saying that some of these policies, including, by the way, backing Saddam in his murderous war against Iran, and then at other times backing Iran in its murderous counter-war against Iraq. This was American policymaking at its worst. If the papers were to come out now, I think that Henry Gonzalez in Congress was beginning to get at the degree to which both the Reagan and Bush administrations tolerated and encouraged the buildup of Saddam's chemical weapons capability, or tolerated certainly, and encouraged, if anything, the funding of a nuclear weapons capability, which we were perfectly aware of during that period, after we knew of his gassing of the Iranians and gassing of the Kurds. I think the the Pentagon papers of that period would, I think, be very highly embarrassing, probably not to Bill Kristol, but to a lot of the people who were writing this administration.
Quick comment, and we got to take a call.
No, I doubt it, but since we haven't seen the papers, we don't know. I would say, look, one has to also weigh seriously the other side of this argument, which is you do want people to give advice serious and
not when it's as bad as this.
No, you do want people to give straightforward advice in government, and there is a way in which, if everything's released merely 5 or 10 or 15 years later, when people are still in government, when governments you're dealing with are still in power, any notion of having a confidential conversation, an honest conversation, weighing serious issues in the balance the way you have to in government, and then you're going to get something wrong and you're going to embarrass some friendly government that's in power 10 years later. Well, there has to be some
There's a little test of that. When I put out 7,000 pages of top secret material, the very kind that's normally kept top secret, people have had now 30 years to look at that and say, are we glad the president got this honest advice at the time, this honest advice to go in, this honest advice that what it would take and so forth, that bombing North Vietnam would quickly win the war in some cases, or could we have better held our officials accountable and changed foreign policy from a disastrous one if we'd known this earlier? I would say
it's just not true, though. You don't think policy would have been different if those papers, the papers didn't change policy.
No, quite the contrary. They didn't change them. May I say, they didn't change them because they were history when I put them out, and I apologize for that, and I regret it. When I put them out, gave them to the Senate in '69, when I gave them to the press in '71, they were now old history, and frankly, I didn't expect them to have much effect, and they didn't have much effect. That's why I've been saying on every possible opportunity right now for the last several months, people who are in the position I was then, who know that there are estimates inside the government that Congress ought to have but are not getting of what the costs of this war might be, are likely to be, what the costs in casualties and Iraqi casualties are likely to be, and know that the president or his officials are in some way lying about those estimates or about the situation, about the real reasons for going in. If that's their belief, I would urge them to consider doing what I wish I'd done back in '64 and didn't do in '65. Go to Congress and the press with those documents. Take your chances of certainly your likelihood of losing your clearance and your career, your profession, and the chance of going to jail, as I did. But a war's worth of lives are at stake, and it's not too late now to tell the truth, bring out the documents, And this is the time to do it, not 5 years from now and not 30 years from now.
I just want to register a strong dissent to that. It's fine for people to take chances with their own lives, and it's fine for you to go to jail as a symbolic matter. It's another thing to take chances with American boys and girls'
That's what
lives
the president and his
Gulf.
advisors are doing.
I'm sorry.
And that's what you've been doing for
I'm sorry. If you are serving this government and there are classified material that could endanger American lives in a war we are currently fighting, a war authorized by Congress with soldiers over there, and you're saying people should put out material that could reveal war plans, that could reveal...
Did you hear me say that?
Well, what does it mean to say estimates of how the war is going to go?
No, I'm saying when the Congress asked the president for a range of estimates of what the U.S. casualties may be, and Paul Wolfowitz, your colleague, says we don't have such estimates. That's a lie. They do, of course, have such estimates, and Congress deserves to have that question answered.
No, what does that mean? So you're going to have a memo somewhere from the Pentagon that says...
So since Wolfowitz won't put it out... Let me give you another example.
Contemporaneously, the Pentagon has to put out, well, if we go fast to Baghdad, we could have 2,000 estimates because our supply lines will be weak and we could get attacked by Fed Yemen. You think we should put that out so the Iraqis can see which weakness of which of our scenarios implies?
I think Congress deserves to know.
Congress has authorized this war.
Yes, in ignorance.
Do you disagree with that?
They have in total ignorance of all the answers. That was irresponsible
to testify.
They should have.
They are the representatives of the government,
and it's not
self-selected civil servants, not self-selected.
I agree with you.
Okay.
But since they're not going to get the truth from those people, they should call up the ones who might tell them the truth. Like the retired officers who have just resigned now in conscience, given up their careers, 3 of them at this point. Congress should hold hearings right now and hear what they have to say.
But those retired officers have not released classified documents about war plans.
Let's forget about the war plans. I know what a war plan is. I've written them and I've read them. And I think you haven't, probably. Isn't that right? I know what war plans look like. I did not put out war plans, and I'm not talking about putting out war plans. I'm talking about putting out information that a responsible civil servant believes in his or her best expert capability. Classified. I'm talking about it. That Congress should have. They can see that as well as you or I, and judge whether American lives will be lost as a result of this. These self-serving judgments that any release endangers American lives is false and ignores the fact that stupid, unwise decision-making is what results in the loss of masses of American lives. So those have to be balanced.
I'm going to take a call, though. I've got to interrupt because this is a call-in show. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'm going to take some calls here now, so get out your pencils and we'll want to listen to the audience. Swansea, Massachusetts, go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd like a comment from Mr. Ellsberg and also bring in Mr. Kristol on a theory that I've read about on the Internet, actually, that this administration is only starting in Iraq, but indeed intends to democratize the entire Mideast and may even be looking for the opportunity to do that.
All right, thanks. Let's go to Charleston, South Carolina. You're on the air.
Yes, I just wanted to ask your people, do they enjoy their freedom? And the way we got our freedom is we fought for it, and the only way the Iraqi people is going to get their freedom is to fight for it. And I support this war, and I support our government. Some documents don't need to be shown at this time or ever, because we got to trust our government and trust our freedom, because that's what we live in the United States for. Thank you.
Houston, Texas, you're on.
Hello. My question is for Billy Kristol. People keep trying to say that Iraq and 9/11 are connected, and I really can't see it. But I can't understand when we knew that 4 airplanes had been hijacked before 9 o'clock. Why did the United States not scramble the airplanes? And I keep hearing that Bush stayed in that little kid's room for 20 minutes without doing anything. Would you comment on that?
Williamston, Georgia, you're on the air.
Yes, sir. I have a comment for Mr. Ellsberg, please. Mr. Ellsberg, are you familiar with an organization called the Red River Valley Fighter Pilots Association? Yes, you can nod your head. I can see you. It is a organization of American prisoners of war from North Vietnam. They're having their 30th commemoration of their release in Las Vegas on the 14th of April. They are interested in having you come and apologize to them because they consider you one of the main reasons that they were incarcerated as long as they were. Your support of North Vietnam is one of the reasons that they feel people like you and of you added to their length of incarceration. Would you be willing to go talk to these American POWs?
Quick answer, because I want to take some more calls.
I wouldn't be willing to go to apologize, but I'd be very happy to discuss my reasons for thinking that it was President Nixon who kept them in as long as they did, and I was trying to shorten their imprisonment.
You'd go
And
to
I
a
actually
hostile
think
audience
I
like
did.
that?
I actually think I did.
You would go to a hostile audience if they...
To discuss that?
Yeah.
I would respect their service, and I would be glad to discuss that.
Concord, New Hampshire, you're on the air.
Yes, I'd like to ask Mr.
Go ahead, please. Are you there? Oh, that's too bad. Warsaw, New York, you're on the air.
Good morning, Brian. I just wanted to, I used to be a caller, but I've become a listener for the last couple of years. But this morning, I am just appalled with the fact that Daniel Ellsberg has taken over your show. And he seems to think that he's got a corner on the truth. This man, that his conscience seems to wander all over the whole moral spectrum. And for him to unilaterally turn over and release the Pentagon Papers, who does he think he should be giving advice to anybody? I think he should be down on his knees every day of his life, begging for mercy and forgiveness from the American people. That's all I'm going to say about it.
One more call, and then we'll go back to our guests. We go to New Canaan, Connecticut. You're on the air. New Canaan, are you there? Please go ahead, pick up the phone, and please talk. That's it. They're going away. Let's go. All right. What are some of the things you heard you want to comment on, Mr. Kristol? What about the connection of Iraq and 9/11?
I think most of those questions were really for Dan Ellsberg. Well, Iraq's clearly connected to terrorist groups. We don't know what, if any, connection there was to 9/11. On the issue of the president's behavior on 9/11 and whether the U.S. government could have stopped those planes once they were hijacked, I don't think there's any reason to think we could have. We just scrambled planes and I think might have been able to shoot down. This would have been a horrible decision to have had to make, though I guess the government had made it, to shoot down that fourth plane if the passengers hadn't themselves brought it down in the field in Pennsylvania, since it would have been coming back presumably to hit the Capitol or the White House or some other place in Washington with lots of people in it. So, I think the government behaved as reasonably well on 9/11. The passengers, I was just talking about this with someone yesterday, Jonathan Last wrote a good piece, visited the field in Pennsylvania where the plane went down, and it seems to me there was a lot of heroism on 9/11, certainly in New York, at the Pentagon, the firefighters, the rescue workers, but the passengers on the plane that went down to Pennsylvania is really an amazing story. I mean, really a story that, and this isn't at all obviously a partisan point or an ideological point, it's just a human point. It's really a very amazing, I mean, it hasn't gotten quite enough attention. It's like something out of a history book or out of a novel. These passengers are flying on a plane, it's hijacked. All the rules of the game then were, of course, if you're hijacked, you sit back, you let it get taken somewhere to Cuba or some nut, and then it gets landed, and hopefully it's safe. You're told in mid-flight on cell phones that these other planes have been hijacked and taken into buildings, and you decide, passengers decide, with no guidance from any government authorities, contrary to, in a sense, what they'd been educated to think, that they are going to charge the front of the plane, knowing it meant their own death, to save other lives. It's really an amazing moment in American history, amazing moment of heroism, I think.
What about the question early on about the theory that this is the start in Iraq and that it will continue throughout the Mideast?
Actually, I would like to hear more about that from Bill Kristol. I asked him, in effect, earlier, what's the next one to invade? That could be hard to answer. I think that it would be very good if all those countries should be democratized. I think that's going to have to be done by their own people, and we can help. We can help. But I don't think it should be done by force, by American force. And I don't know if I think he does disagree. In other words, I think he thinks that does have a role to play in Syria or Iran, conceivably eventually in Pakistan. And I think it doesn't for a lot of reasons, because I don't think it would lead to democracy and would be very dangerous.
Well, look, I think we have made a mistake in the last 20 years in the Middle East, unlike in other parts of the world where I think it's a bit of a bum rap against America that we've never been pushed towards democracy. We've pushed towards democracy in Asia, and we, in fact, have great success stories. And sometimes we don't get along with the governments now, like in South Korea, but Taiwan's an amazing success story. I think Latin and Central America is, on the whole, an amazing success story over the bitter opposition of the left in the 70s and 80s. We now have decent and democratic governments in most of Latin and Central America, certainly not the case 20 or 30 years ago. Will it be easy to do in the Middle East? No, but I think we have made this deal with dictators that was foolish and has backfired in any case and is untenable. Doesn't mean we have to invade all or most or perhaps any other countries in the Middle East. I think Iran has great prospects for a democratic, probably peaceful democratic revolution of an East European type, and I think we should be much more aggressive in supporting the dissidents and the students there politically and diplomatically and through public diplomacy and that sort of thing. And, you know, I'm reasonably hopeful, actually, about the Middle East. That's why Iraq is important. If we could break the hold of one tyranny and help them set up a decent, federated government there in a nation that has Shia, that has Sunnis, that has Kurds, that would be a terrific success story in the Middle East. It would be add to Israel and Turkey, add another country to those two as democratic countries in the region, and really could have a trigger effect elsewhere, I think.
You know, I really have a very different sense now, not when I was in the government, of what our role has been in the third world, which is very distinguishable from our role in the developed industrial societies where we have been allies with democracy and have promoted democracy. I don't think that's a fair generalization of what we've really done, and not just by accident. This is a disillusioning experience for me. Let me make a generalization here that I think will be very provocative to a lot of the listeners here. And I'd have to say, I've been speaking and I've been on the air for 30 years now, and I haven't heard the denunciations. It's interesting to me in a way. Of course, it's not pleasant to hear the attacks. It no doubt has something to do, obviously, with the fact that we're in a war right now where people are very understandably want to believe in the president, want to support our troops, which certainly I do, and perceive me as somehow opposing that. But in any case, I think this will be a provocative assertion. I wouldn't have believed it myself 30 years ago. I find our policy in many parts of the world has been to promote dictatorship, often death squad dictatorship of the most murderous kind, and I'm speaking here now of El Salvador, Guatemala, Indonesia. I could name really quite a few other places where our policy, why? Because we like to murder people? No, but because we think the alternative, including the democratic alternative, going all the way back to Mossadegh, whom we replaced in a coup by the Shah back in early 50s and later in Guatemala. We thought that the dictator was better for our interests. And that was clearly the policy that we've had in Iraq. And I would guess will continue to be our policy. I'm basing my pessimistic predictions on the past U.S. policy, which I think is going to be extended. People in Iraq, I understand from people who are there now, do perceive Hussein as a dictator. How could they not? But as a dictator that the Americans chose for them.
That's just not true. I mean, look, we had mistakes in our Iraq policy. It's just ludicrous. We didn't choose Hussein.
Oh, pardon me.
We didn't put him in power.
In 1963, we didn't put him in power. In 1963, when there was a brief uprising of the Ba'ath, we supplied specifically Saddam with lists, as we did in Indonesia, lists of people to be eliminated. And since he's a murderous thug, but at that time our murderous thug, he eliminated them. When his party came to power,
that is right. The Kennedy administration personally supplied Saddam?
Personally supplied.
Well, they shouldn't have.
Yes. No, they shouldn't have. But it wasn't just a marginal error. Same thing went on in '68. He was our thug, just as Somoza and Noriega and a lot of other people who were on the leash until they got off the leash, and then we eliminated them, like No Din Siem. This is not a familiar notion to Americans.
It's not,
I don't expect even friendly.
It's a wild oversimplification.
No.
The Ba'ath Party was not a pro-American party. We were not happy with the Ba'ath Party.
It was better, however, than the alternative in our view.
Well,
why did we support Saddam as recently as when you were in the administration? And the answer is we
didn't support
preferred
Saddam when I was in the administration.
Pardon me, to even after the Iraq. First of all,
when did we support Saddam in 1991 or 92 or 90?
When were you in the administration?
89 to 93. 92.
Okay, we've just expressed that, and I've said several times, I've raised the question of whether you might not reasonably have done more than you did to oppose it.
We went to war against Saddam. I didn't notice a huge amount of left-wing support for that war. Maybe I missed it. Maybe I missed the huge support on the left of the war for going against Saddam, for kicking Saddam out of Kuwait.
The left was not in a position to threaten or shoot Saddam's helicopters out of the air when they were massacring Shia and Kurds.
I participated in criticism of the first President Bush's administration in which I served, but let me just say a word on his behalf. He went to war to remove Saddam from Kuwait.
Kuwait.
Right.
Not from power.
Right, against the opposition of the huge bulk of the Democratic Party in the Congress and the Senate, against the opposition of the huge majority of left-wing organs. And maybe you personally, and I honor you for this if it's true, were supporting our going to war against Kuwait, but certainly none of the magazines you write for, if I could say, and most of your colleagues on the left were not. So let's give President Bush some credit. I don't want to be in a
false position here. At that time, I agreed with Senator Nunn in his hearing.
Oh, so you were against the liberation of Kuwait?
No, on the contrary. At that time, a number of former four-star military people, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who were foursquare for containing Saddam initially, preventing him by military means from getting into Saudi Arabia as was threatened, and I supported that publicly, at the cost of some relationships, by the way. When they said when it came to expelling him from Kuwait, they wanted to give the blockade and the embargo an ability on the belief of people like Admiral Crowe and General Birchenall that that was preferable to the deaths that would be involved in trying to expel him militarily. We didn't test that.
That was not the argument. The argument was not that the sanctions would get him out of Kuwait. The argument was that we could keep him out of Saudi Arabia.
No, not by sanctions? Not at all.
Who seriously thought he was going to be expelled from Kuwait by sanctions?
Practically everyone who testified before Senator Nunn, who was no left-wing radical, and Senator Nunn himself. You've forgotten the history of that.
I remember the history vividly. No. President Bush was right, Senator Nunn was wrong.
Well, it worked out. Senator Nunn's career, he did overestimate the American costs of going in, as did many of the generals and Schwarzkopf and so forth. They were less than now. On the other hand, I remain happy that President Bush, Schwarzkopf, and Powell did not test whether Iraqi troops would fight better in Baghdad than near Baghdad.
Well, then you really, with all due respect, it is irresponsible for you, it is disingenuous of you to try to ally yourself with those like me and Paul Wolfowitz who say we should have supported the rebellion and finished the job,
no, not at
and
all.
Then say, but you're happy, of course, we didn't go to Baghdad. Because that would have been immoral. That would have been immoral. Half steps to help the rebels would have been the worst of all worlds.
I didn't say we should not help them. I've said several times at this table.
You said you're unwilling. If you cannot begin down that road.
You didn't hear me.
You cannot begin. Yeah, let me just finish the sentence. You cannot begin down that road unless you're willing to say that if you begin to help the rebels, you're willing to go to the end and kill and finish off Saddam.
I agree to that.
Okay, well then we're in agreement.
So we're not disagreeing.
Okay.
What I said was that in particular I would have agreed precisely because we would have been helping a popular uprising at that time. I've said that several times. You've heard it? Okay.
Calls. Zeeland, Michigan, you're on the air.
Yes. In this world that is becoming more uncertain because of the uncertainty of what morality is, what is moral and what isn't moral, I was delighted to hear a program where Barbara Walters interviewed 4 Iraqi women who came to this country in 1991 because they were oppressed and had observed the cruelty and the tyranny of Saddam. And I was really impressed with the answer that one of the women gave at the very end of the program. She said, we don't know for sure how many people Saddam has murdered. Somewhere between 1 million or 2 million or maybe more in the last 10 years. And her question was, how many more people will he murder in the next 10 years? And her point was that it was the cost is hidden, and there are other costs that are hidden. How many more? How can we discourage the terrorists from killing more people in the United States of America or other places around the world? So there's some hidden costs.
Thanks, caller. New Canaan, Connecticut, you're on the air.
I'd like to know, crystal ball with a C, in the future when this war ends, don't know how long it'll take, but when the war ends, if we can retrieve our credentials of morality in the world by really being with the UN, or do we go off and orchestrate the use of the oil and keep the people under oppression with another dictator, which in that case would be ours?
Hurley, New Mexico. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Ellsberg. I was against the war to start, but now that we're in it, what I would like to ask is, what do the demonstrators and yourself think would be the repercussions if we did stop the war and withdraw? 2 wrongs don't make a right. Could you just address this? Thank you.
Thanks. One more call. Philippi, West Virginia. Go ahead, please.
Hi. I wanted to say thank you to Mr. Ellsberg. The truth is never popular among the masses, and he went out of his way to make sure that America knew the truth. And I'm against the war. I'm very much against the war. I pray every day for our troops. They're doing their job. they could be conscientious.
Thanks. Mr. Kristol, morality have to do with when we get our credentials back. How do we get it? We're going to be a big supporter of the UN when this all is over?
Well, I think we'll have, I think the moral credentials of this war are strong, and we'll see if we follow through. I agree with Mr. Ellsberg on this. If we need to follow through and be serious about helping the Iraqi people rebuild their country and about helping promote a decent democratic government in Iraq, and I will agree that we will have, it would still be a good thing to remove a brutal dictator like Saddam who has weapons of mass destruction. It would still be the right thing to do, but it would be a much less morally satisfying and fully defensible war if we don't follow through as we should. And I've worked very hard, and I signed a letter today with some of us Republicans and some Democrats urging the administration to, as I think it's done pretty well, to really to follow through on the democracy agenda, on the nation-building agenda in Iraq. I think the administration deserves some credit for overcoming what I think was a little bit of a silly reluctance a couple of years ago, silly aversion to the notion of nation-building that was left over from sort of the Republican Congress in the 90s. So I'm happy to be held to a moral standard. I ask that it be a serious moral standard, which, as one of the callers I think pointed out quite intelligently, also involves the cost of doing nothing. You know, to governors to choose, and to choose to do nothing is a kind of choice, and we just need to be, and these are not, we can't know ever what would have happened if we hadn't acted as we have acted, obviously, but we need, in these moral discussions, and I think Mr. Ellsberg has been serious about this too, I mean, that we need to be serious about the moral choices we face and the consequences of inaction and the consequences of action, and I would therefore, I do think I'd be interested in your answer to the last caller, because this is something that's concerned me too. It's one thing to be, it's perfectly legitimate to have said this war was a mistake, we could have contained Saddam, there were other ways to do it, it wasn't an immediate threat, et cetera, et cetera. To say now, I mean, what is the practical, I guess, recommendation or wish of the demonstrators if they were to have their way? That is, do people really think that ending the war in mid-course is a morally preferable action to finishing it at this point? And what is the practical, therefore, purpose of these demonstrations at this moment? What are you calling on the government to do? I mean, because you are a morally serious man, and it's not a matter simply, I take it, therefore, of expressing one's unhappiness. That's been expressed. There have been congressional votes and plenty of demonstrations before the war began. But it is true that demonstrating once a war has begun has a somewhat different, I think, implication. In the case of Vietnam, it was clear the demonstrators wanted the war to end, and they had some success and probably maybe speeding up the end of the war. We could argue whether that was morally better or worse. I'm not so sure. It ended up as a morally superior situation. Our withdrawal from Vietnam in '75, I guess I would still think that maybe we should have fought and supported the South Vietnamese in '75, given the ghastly consequences of letting Vietnam and Cambodia fall then. But that's a separate debate. But I mean, one has to be, but there the anti-war protesters were serious in the sense that they wanted that war ended, and they were willing to say that ending the war was a morally superior alternative to continuing it. Are people saying that today?
No, we're in an anguishing situation today. There are no good alternatives. Neither you nor I nor the president or anybody else has a magic wand, military or otherwise, that can make everything right again or make this thing come out very well. I don't think it is going to come out very well, probably, but I hope it does. I'd be very happy, for instance, and I have nothing to do with it, I'd be very happy if Saddam were to disappear either by death or flight. Yesterday or tomorrow. I'd be very happy if the most optimistic and confident predictions of our civilian advisors to Rumsfeld had come true and that the defections had taken place. I hope they take place tomorrow and that all their people lay down their arms, and that's not impossible. It's not impossible, and would vindicate those judgments. That would be a way of ending the war with minimum loss of life. And I have no doubt that the regime, which I'm describing as very limited democracy, which I foresee, because I don't think will allow popular will that might lead to splitting up of Iraq. But within those limits, it will certainly be a more decent regime than Saddam's. I'd be very happy if that took place. That doesn't seem very likely, so let's look at what are more practical alternatives at this point. Well, particularly the mass defection doesn't seem very likely. I don't have the answer, and it is anguishing. I do have two suggestions right now from what we've seen just in the last week and 3 weeks. First of all, the denunciation of France, Russia, China, and not just of a French veto, but the inability of the U.S. To get by bribery or intimidation or persuasion, even as far as I can tell, Cameroon or Angola or Chile or countries that really depend on our aid and trade like Chile and Mexico to agree with us, to go along as clearly the administration predicted, I think doesn't reflect in each case cynical calculations on their part. They reflect good judgment that we should not be going to war under these circumstances. They were refusing authorization, not just going on vacation and not happening to vote. That tells me that their judgment was better as of till now than that of the administration, and that gives us a way to proceed. Start listening to them. Start taking seriously when the French and the Russians and the Chinese and the Angolans and the Chileans and the others have their contribution to make, and others who aren't on the Security Council. I noticed on C-SPAN this morning before I came over, yesterday's debate, and I was thinking, I would like the president right now to be listening to what their suggestions are. I doubt, by the way, if they have the point of just get on the boats and just go back, that they have suggestions as to how to deal, and I think we ought to pay close attention to them. And on the other hand, I think the president has been clearly at this point, unless the most confident predictions are carried out in the next day or two, unless there are mass defections, unless the command and control appears to, and unless city fighting in Baghdad turns out not to be necessary. That's the contingency I think really deserves, we need to know what the military people think about that. I think President Bush should be thinking seriously of changing his set of civilian advisors on the DoD side very sharply. I think that people like Paul Wolfowitz, your colleague on the Project for New American Century, I was glad to see that Pearl was removed for other reasons, showing other kinds of bad judgment on his part. Bolton, Fife, Bolton in the State Department. I think all these people should be looked at very closely and perhaps replaced by other people. The military leadership that went along with them in a plan that apparently they resisted so far should either be listened to now or replaced, and I think Secretary Rumsfeld is due for replacement. We are in a war, and in a war, the commander-in-chief has the obligation to protect the troops in the interests of this country by moving commanders and moving officials that have given him bad advice and finding others that will do better.
You probably shouldn't remove them after a week when we've suffered about 25 casualties, 25 deaths in combat.
Perhaps that's a little early. However,
you think a little early, maybe? You think it would kind of ruin the military if we changed our general every week?
There does seem to be a... well, I've known generals who did that.
This demonization of particular individuals is really unworthy of you.
Pardon?
The President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, the National Security Advisor of the President of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State have concurred in this policy.
Yeah, definitely.
So I mean, this notion that let's pick on a Deputy Secretary of Defense because he actually saw ahead of some of these other people that Iraq was a big threat.
I understand you're defending Paul Wolfowitz here, who's been your colleague. I would say that if you were in the government right now, with your known views that have been with these people right now, I'd of course be including you in that. But I don't mean to say just kick the subordinates overseas in a very cynical way. I'm really trying to be practical here as who to listen to in the favor of the troops and in favor of our country right now. I think that President Bush might very well say, might very well from a moral point of view, I made a terrible mistake here. I should remove these troops the way that on a much smaller scale. Hold on a minute. Wait, but he's not going to do that.
Well, what evidence is there so far that he's been mistaken in any fundamental way?
It's just a way to start to looking. By the way, I don't know exactly what advice they've been giving. We've had only leaks on that. There have been leaks now for months that there were major disagreements between the military and Rumsfeld and his advisors as to how many troops were needed. This is a technical decision to protect our rear over there. He should now, I think, be looking, Bush and Rumsfeld, at the people who advised that we didn't have to worry about having our lives.
You should be second-guessing
instead
of figuring out how to weak the war.
Give it another week.
This is unworthy of
you.
I mean,
pardon me,
really
give it another week, but remember,
you are in favor
I
of
was
debates,
in a war.
I take it. You were in favor of the civilians, and I believe exercising civilian control of the military.
Oh,
you were
absolutely.
in favor of challenging the military plans. You were probably in favor of, therefore, with the civilians saying, gee, do we really need to send 500,000 troops over there? Now, the fact, my sense is they ended up with a compromise plan, and so far there have been obviously, as always, some tough judgment calls, but it seems to be going pretty well.
Got to go to Richardson, Texas. Go ahead, Richardson, you're on the air.
I don't think so.
Hello.
Yes, sir. I am supporting the president. I'm not for war, but I'm going to have to support the president and the military and such. And I've seen Mr. Kristol on a lot of TV shows, and I think it'd really be neat to be able
to ask him some questions, but obviously the other gentleman's going to be the one that's going to run it. So I have some questions.
You can ask me. You can ask me questions.
Go ahead. Ask me anything.
Well,
Let's
no,
just see over here.
I really, because if I ask that Mr. Kristol, that other guy's going to jump in. So, and I'm going to tell you right quick, I'm the epitome of a Southern boy. I'm just an old retired cop down here in Texas, but I did serve a little bit in the military, and I'd like to ask that gentleman, and I'll first apologize because I really haven't read his book, but I was in the military, and I have had some classified exposure to some very sensitive stuff in the military, and I'd like to know how he was able to take, I'm supposing, and again, I said I didn't read his book, so I don't know what else in there, how he was able to take so much of the classified stuff and I guess make a book and maybe a good living out of it, and maybe he could share that with somebody like me. And I don't know if he went to jail or anything, but if he didn't, I think it'd be cool to be able to know. Like I said, I'm a retired cop on a limited budget, so if he could share on how you could take classified information and do a book and maybe make a good living out of turning stuff out to the public that shouldn't have been. And then also the second part, and then I'm going to hang up because I do like to listen to this stuff. How intelligent does he think he is to be able to identify mistakes that other people have made and then dwell on it? And obviously everybody makes mistakes. Maybe everybody, but him. How much of the background and what's his education in to be able to identify mistakes and then dwell on that. So I'm going to listen, and I do watch y'all every once in a while. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Let me ask a couple questions before either one of you answer. You graduated from Harvard undergrad what year?
52.
You graduated what year?
73.
You got a PhD there? In what?
Economics.
You got a PhD?
Political science.
What year?
79.
I'm sorry, 62.
62. You did not serve in the military, is that right?
No.
And you served for how many years in the Marine Corps?
3 years. I was in for 2 and extended for 1.
Don't want to go through all the details on this, but go back to the Pentagon Papers. You said that you gave them to the Congress in 69, then to the New York Times and 17 other newspapers in 1971. Were you prosecuted?
Oh, I was indicted and was under indictment for 2 years. I was in court for 4.5 months till charges. I was facing 12 felony counts, which would have totaled a total sentence of 115 years. I was under that for a couple of years. Just before the case went to the jury, a number of crimes by President Nixon and his White House staff against me during the trial were revealed in the early part of the Watergate hearings. My charges were dismissed on grounds of governmental misconduct, and these crimes figured in the impeachment proceedings which led to President Nixon's resignation.
And over the years, what have you done since then? What kind of work have you done?
Oh, first of all, I made I made no money out of the Pentagon Papers. I copied them at my own expense at commercial establishments, 10 cents a page, $700 a copy for a 7,000-page document. I paid all the expenses of giving those to the Senate and other copies to the New York Times later. Took all my savings, actually. And did not write a book at that time, in part because I didn't want to be seen as profiting from this terrible experience of the war.
And you wrote the book last year?
I wrote the book 30 years later.
That your first book?
No, I wrote a book of previous essays I'd done called Papers on the War back in '72.
Charlotte, North Carolina, go ahead, please.
Hello.
You're on the air.
Yes, sir. First of all, I want to congratulate Mr. Ellsberg, and I'm glad there is a voice of truth on American TV, because I'm sick and tired of the CNN propaganda. I want to tell your listeners that people in this country are watching other channels in Europe, and they get the truth. And most of his conversation that I watch, he's very truthful. I'm against the war, and this government needs to go, and because it's humiliating the Americans in Europe. He's a very, how can I say, not stupid, but very mean president. He's been selected by the Christian coalition and some oil companies. And for so many years in this country, is the first time that I see so much propaganda, so much censorship
All right, thanks. Mr. Kristol, start with her suggestion that CNN is full of propaganda and that you have to go overseas to get the truth.
I think listen to overseas channels is what she was saying. Channels.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Well, I'm under contract with Fox News Channel, so I have to disclose that before I attack CNN. But, well, it's nice to hear that people think CNN has some pro-American and, I suppose, pro-Bush propaganda. I hadn't really noticed much of it, but look, I think people get a diversity of views in this country. I actually think there's been a very vigorous debate over the war. One of the things you hear from the protesters is this has not been adequately debated. I don't buy that. There's been a very, very vigorous debate in the mainstream press, on television, certainly in journals of opinion like the Weekly Standard, I edit, like the Nation magazine that I think Mr. Ellsberg contributes to sometimes. We don't have quite the circulation of CNN or the Fox News Channel, but we're read and I hope have some influence. So I think there's been a pretty vigorous debate, and I think people have been exposed to the real arguments for and against the war, the real moral and political questions raised by the war, raised by doing nothing, as well as raised by going in and intervening.
Have people been able to get the truth by watching American television?
It's not my impression. I would disagree with Bill on that question. I don't think there has been a range of views on this, particularly. I do think that people can get it, by the way, and perhaps the reader was referring to this, the listener I call reader, that we do have the internet now that we didn't have 30 years ago. And that does give a chance to get not only views from around the world, especially the English-speaking world, but an outfit like antiwar.com I happen to have discovered and become a fan of. I read it every day because they collect editorials and news comments by the moment.
Where would you go?
From all over the world.
Let me just ask you this question about television. Now, where would you go in other countries, on other channels, to get the so-called debate, the truth, that you can't get here in this country?
You get a lot more information on Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which can be seen on C-SPAN, I think, and on BBC outfit, my impression is. But I was going to say in the print, on the internet, the British Independent, the British Observer, and Guardian are in antiwar.com. I see a lot there including American stories that are really quite amazing to me that don't get covered over here in the press or in television. I could give an example of that. But I also see covered there, collected in one place, editorials from all over this country. And I think if you really can get a pretty good picture from, say, antiwar.com, commondreams.org, buzzflash.com. These people collect editorials and comments that I wish, I must say, our newspapers and CNN were looking at as much, because if you collect in one place all the things that you get from all over the country, in St. Louis and Miami and Pittsburgh, you really can get a pretty good picture, which is to the credit of the press, much better than you'll get from any one newspaper, whether it's the New York Times or the Washington Post or, I think, any channel.
It's easier just to go to weeklystandard.com and read what we post every day. Then you don't have to worry about all these hundreds of editorials.
I hope you have a copy of that with you. I haven't seen it.
And foreign papers.
Rochester, New York, you're on the air.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to ask a question about protesters. Why is it cities in this country don't designate an area outside of the streets for them to protest? Does anybody have an answer to that?
Yeah, the First Amendment to the United States, people have the right peaceably to assemble, to petition their government for a redress of grievances. They don't really have to go outside the city limits to do that.
Mobile, Alabama.
But it's a good question. If I could just interrupt for one second, which is, I mean, there are these parks and city limits where people can protest. Protesters choose to lie down in streets, to obstruct traffic, to get arrested. That is an act of civil disobedience. It's a moral choice. It has moral consequences. Ambulances, I happen to know someone who's going to the hospital stuck in traffic in San Francisco because the whole city was tied up by protesters. That's a moral consequence of protest, too.
We have I've heard anecdotal, hypothetical accounts of that for years, and I don't doubt it could happen.
Well,
you actually know? I'd be interested.
I was in San Francisco as it happens. So.
I'd like to know the name and number.
But I mean, it's a good question. Well, there's a park right out this window here. People can protest all they want.
I was arrested in Lafayette Park.
Right.
We were arrested. Why? For praying in Lafayette Park. And when I say praying, nearly everybody else there was. This was on just the other day. I was a priest, and on two bishops, two Nobel Prize laureates. We were sitting and praying and meditating without authorization to do that, to symbolize in part that we're protesting a war that is without authorization. in this war, and that it has very great moral implications. I was very honored to be with a number of the people there, like Bishop Gumbleton and Mairead Maguire, who is the Nobel Peace Prize winner for peace in Ireland, but also all of the other people. I was honored. I think in part we were telling each other, which is reassuring, and the country and the world, that we think this war is very wrong. There are Americans here, patriotic Americans, who agree with the majority of the people in the rest of the world. And I'm not talking only about the huge number of protesters or activists. The majority is shown by polls who think this is wrong. We may be in a minority. I think we are in a minority here. But it's a lot of people, and I think it's good for the world to know that, actually.
Mobile,
that there are
Alabama.
people who are even willing to go to jail.
Hello, Mobile.
Yes, Mr. Kristol, bear with me. First, I'd like to make a comment and then two quick questions. I must say you're very slick, and I'm always impressed how you can constantly smile while making a case for war. It's probably because you've never seen military action. You said we can afford to do nothing. The UN inspectors were doing something until they were stopped by Britain and the United States. Now, I have two questions. If weapons of mass destruction are not found in the numbers alleged by Colin Powell, and two, if the majority of Iraqi civilians resist the invasion of their country in the name of democracy, how then will the Bush administration deal with these possibilities and still justify their war of aggression?
Mr. Kristol.
Look, I would be shocked if we don't find weapons of mass destruction, and I think that is one of the main rationales for the war, and if we don't find them, we would have been wrong, at least in arguing that he had them. We wouldn't have been wrong that he had them. We wouldn't be wrong in arguing that he was a threat to have them. But I expect us to find them, and I think if we don't find them, that would undercut in part the rationale for the war. Similarly, I think it's a bit much to expect, and Mr. Ellsberg has said this a few times, popular uprisings as if it's so easy to rise up against a totalitarian regime. But I would agree that if after the war we aren't treated more or less as a liberating force, if people aren't happy that they have had Saddam's tyranny removed, as Germans were happy after the war, even though they fought bitterly till the end, then that would also be a rebuke to the Bush administration, to those of us who counseled that this war was just and necessary. I mean, this was I accept the possibility that I'm wrong. I mean, I can't deny that. I hope and pray that I'm not. I don't think I am, but obviously that would be a great blow if Saddam has not been developing weapons of mass destruction.
Leander, Texas, go ahead, please.
Yes, I just wanted to say that I was old enough, okay, unlike Mr. Kristol, I was old enough when Mr. Daniel Ellsberg was exposed for exposing the Pentagon Papers. The only reason that the government misconduct that he mentioned, the reason he wasn't charged, was because they broke into his psychiatrist's office and got those particular papers. He and Jane Fonda were one of the most the primary sources, in other words, of propaganda against the Vietnam War, and that is one reason we didn't win that war, is because of his actions. Okay. Another thing. Let me ask one other thing. I just wanted to say.
Let me ask you a question, please.
I am in support of President Bush, and also this.
Why don't you answer what she has to say?
Well, what I put out was not propaganda. It was classified top secret. It had documented, these were government documents, internal documents, which documented a case that 4 presidents in a row prior to President Nixon had lied us into that war on practically every aspect of the war, deceived us, and not Democrat or Republican, but both, on the costs of the war, on the prospects, on the aims of the war, on what was to be expected, and on what was being done there. It was history when I put it out, and I wish I'd had current documents to put out. I would have done that then, because the war was still going on in '71. Some of the heaviest war ahead was in '72. President Nixon, who's gotten credit, I think among those Red River pilots who spoke earlier, has gotten credit for ending the war. In fact, came into office in '69 when there was 30,000 American dead, an enormous number, and he added over 20,000 to the names on the Vietnam Memorial. That was wrong, and that was the process I was trying to stop by putting out truths any way that I could.
Let me ask Bill Kristol, what do you think of what Dan Ellsberg did back then?
I don't know. I haven't actually thought that much about it. I mean, in general, I think general, one should not take it upon oneself, obviously, to release classified documents. We have a democratic system in this country. We have accountability to Congress. No one of us should decide because, you know, we happen to think the world will benefit from knowing this particular bad piece of advice that was given 5 years ago, and we happen to have it in our possession, having left government, that we should put it out. So I, in general, am against publishing classified documents. I will accept that Vietnam was an unusual moment, and that it may also be the case that, well, I will accept that it was an unusual moment, and I accept certainly that Mr. Ellsberg did it for high motives. He didn't do it to make money or anything like that. I don't know that it made much difference, in all honesty, in the course of the war. I mean, it's not as if President Nixon didn't end the war any more quickly, I don't think, because of it. I think he was on that path anyway in 1971, 72. I think it may have helped create the sense that the war was, as Mr. Ellsberg just said, based on lies from the beginning, which I'm not so sure is the case, and therefore may have encouraged the Democratic Congress, just say the Congress, in 73, 74, 75, to forbid us to help the South Vietnamese resist the final North Vietnamese invasion, which I guess I think, in that respect, I think that was a bad thing. That is, I still think we could have preserved a decent South Vietnamese government in 1975. We had a decent South Vietnamese government in 1973 and 74. We had won the war in some respects against North Vietnam. We had a decent Cambodian government too, and the horrors of 75 to about 78, 79, I think perhaps could have been avoided if the judgment hadn't settled in, and of course if Nixon hadn't done Watergate and gotten impeached and all that, and I'm not going to defend Nixon's behavior at all. So that was a huge problem too. But if all that hadn't happened, I think we would have pursued a better foreign policy in 1975.
One other quick question, then I'll take a call. But what do you think of the idea of breaking into his psychiatrist's office for his record?
Well, obviously that's wrong.
I mean, our caller suggested that was a good deal. I mean, because he was on Jane Fonda's side, that was all right.
Well, I don't think it was legal, and I think it was wrong.
Interestingly, it's become legal. Under the Patriot Act now, that would not have been illegal, breaking and entering and not informing me of in search of information with which to shut me up would now be legal.
Well,
just
if they had reason
by the
to
way,
believe
it
you
wasn't.
if they had reason to believe you were a terrorist.
But no, well, if they had reason to believe that, not that I was a terrorist, it's not quite that exclusive. Well, if it was against the national interest, then it's pretty much up to them. There isn't a lot of monitoring.
That is not the language. There is a lot of monitoring. This is all.
Well, I'm just saying that I think that Nixon today.
It's simply not the case.
By the way,
what you just said. It would not be legal to break into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office today under the Patriot Act, unless you were colluding with terrorists.
We'll see. I hope this is not.
Do you think
tested.
A lot of people's psychiatrist's offices are being broken into by the federal government today?
Yeah.
Oh, that's ridiculous. You really think so?
Yeah.
You think people like you are being?
Well, I think that the president.
Bugged,
I think
into?
The purpose of the act. Well, I'll give an example. You said bugged. The warrantless wiretap, which Nixon had to conceal, on which I'd been overheard of his own state, is clearly legalized under the Patriot Act.
It's
and the use,
legalized against
the use
people
of the
who are
CIA
colluding with terrorism.
And who decides that? Ashcroft?
No, the Justice Department of the United States,
well, that's
pursuant to court action.
That's Ashcroft.
I'm sorry. Not Ashcroft. That's just ridiculous. You've been in government. He's the Attorney General of the United States.
Well, you think there's no the people under him?
You think there should be no ability to fight terrorism?
I'm saying that putting CIA. No.
Is wiretapping wrong?
Listen, let me go to a very. The warrantless wiretapping then was illegal, and therefore he had to keep it concealed. Therefore, he had to bribe various people to keep their mouths shut in front of the grand jury. I'm saying he would have less. The president now would have less reason to conceal it.
The wiretaps that we used to issue an indictment of Mr. Al-Sami in Florida, which is an indictment in court. He will have a full federal trial under the U.S. system. You think it is wrong the wiretaps we used to find this man who was funding terror?
Should there be wiretaps? Certainly. Should the NSA be turned loose virtually freely, or the CIA, as is now the case, now encouraged, as Tom Houston wanted to do under Nixon, to collaborate totally and have the CIA cooperate with the CIA almost without adequate limits, without adequate debate. Look, when you talk about the safeguards here and you talk about there's been adequate debate on television, I notice you didn't use the word Congress. Would you say there have been adequate hearings on either the Patriot Act or the resolution in Congress? There were hardly any hearings. There was hardly any debate. That was supine of Congress. It was supine of Congress. No, it was just absurd. They signed away our liberties here, and I'm very, very critical of most of the Democrats in Congress, with some admirable exceptions, like Barbara Lee and like Kucinich and like Ted Kennedy and not like, let's say, John Kerry, for example, so who just signed these things away. But on the issue of terrorism, which we really have discussed surprisingly little in these 2 hours, and I would like to come up, she raised it, we have a serious terrorist threat in this country. I think the al-Qaeda threat to us is a real danger, far outweighing any danger that we faced from Saddam Hussein. I think, by the way, they're not the only ones on that list that would go higher than Saddam Hussein. I think the North Korean program is more serious. They might well give weapons to al-Qaeda far before Saddam would, unless he's attacked, and he doesn't have them to give now. I think the Russian loose nuclears are more serious. But let's just take the terrorist. Sorry to go on, but it's such an important issue. I believe this war increases the danger of more 9/11s, and there will be undoubtedly more. The question is how many, how big. I believe that the flow of recruits, if we are led to go beyond our present good rules of engagement, which have been relatively, even unprecedentedly scrupulous in not targeting civilians. If that changes, if the war goes on weeks or even the 2 months you discuss it, I hope it doesn't. And that's part of what the demonstrations are calling for. If that happens, there will be a
Mr. Kristol, because we got to
flow
go back
of
to
terrorists.
I just want to register Mr. Ellsberg's, I think, true praise of the rules of engagement. Rules of engagement insisted on by Don Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz and Tommy Franks, these people who allegedly have no concern for Iraqi life.
I didn't say that.
I know, but who allegedly, according to many, don't. And look, on the war on terror, it was a major assault, talking point of those who were very critical of the war in Iraq, that the build-up in Iraq would hurt the prosecution of the war on terror and would encourage more terror against us. So far, that has not been the case.
In the first week, no.
Well, no, but we've had a pretty good 18 months. I mean, I must say, I've been critical of the Bush administration at times, worried they're not doing enough in the war on terror overseas and at home. But if you had told me on September 12th that we would be sitting here in March, whatever it is, 28th, and there would have been no major assaults. I mean, John Ashcroft, it's very easy to say the word John Ashcroft and get knowing chuckles and scorn from liberal audiences, because, you know, God forbid, he's a serious Christian and a conservative. But the fact is, I think Ashcroft's Justice Department probably deserves some credit for the fact that we haven't had a second major act of terror on American soil, or really against American citizens abroad.
Do you believe this war will reduce
months.
the chance of terror as a treatment? Okay, that's a major disagreement.
Osama bin Laden's recruiting videos said America is the weak horse. If America looks weak, there will be more terror against America.
That's Osama bin Laden.
Right, and he is the head terrorist.
That's not Saddam. Yes,
Minnesota,
right.
come on in, Minnesota.
That's not Saddam
Thief
Hussein,
River Falls, you're on the air.
Yes, I would like to thank Mr. Ellsberg for his patriotic service to our country. And I would recommend that people go on the internet and find an article by Michael Dobbs called United States Had Key Role in Iraq Buildup, Trade in Chemical Arms Allowed Despite Their Use on Iranians and Kurds. It was written by Michael Dobbs, and it's in the Washington Post, December 30th, 2002. And in that article, it talked about national security defense decisions number 114 and 139. And I tried to get them, and in calling the numbers that were given to me, I got a Freedom of Information Act, but I got a Republican person at the Reagan Library, and I had to make another call to finally get this information sent to me. 114 was not available. It's classified, and 139 was sent to me, but most of it was blocked out. And I would like to speak for more transparency in this government. I also believe that Bush has made false statements saying that Iraq's oil will be used for the good of the people, their people, when in fact the oil will be filtered through the fingers of Cheney's, Halliburton, Kellogg, Brown and Root, and the ones who portion out the oil are the ones who make the money. Vice President Cheney and the old Reagan and Bush Ford people such as Rumsfeld, Armitage, Wolfowitz, Pearl are going to make huge profits from the war. I think the reason for taking over Iraqi's treasure and oil industry is to fund Republican candidates.
Thanks, caller. Let me, we are running out of time, and I don't want to take the entire time. We've got another caller waiting. But let me start by asking Mr. Kristol to respond to her accusations that Rumsfeld et al. Are making money off of this for the Halliburtons and the stuff like that.
No, it's not true. I think the oil will be used for the Iraqi people, and Halliburton, most oil executives, I don't know them that well, but the one or two I've run into were against the war. Actually disrupts the stable flow of oil supplies in the Middle East. If you had a policy that cared, if you had a policy, because they are like the first Bush administration, they care more about stability. If we had a policy that wanted to secure safe and steady oil from the Middle East, we would have the French policy.
Do you have any reaction to her call?
I think that the issue here is not oil for profits for individuals here. And I believe these people are patriotic and are doing what's best, what they believe is best for this country. I think their judgment is very bad, but I think oil is very much involved. I think, as Michael Clare has put it, not so much oil for energy or oil for profits, though those are somewhat involved, but oil for power, oil for leverage in the world, to do good, to run the world as we see fit. And the control of the oil of the whole Middle East, I think, is seen as very important to that.
Let me go to Louisville, Kentucky. You're on the air.
Yes, my comments are, first of all, I support our president and our troops totally. And my comments are to Mr. Ellsberg. First of all, you brag about your Harvard degrees.
I did.
And yes, you did. And,
I try to conceal it generally, but it was brought out by our host here. But we share that. We share that.
But anyway, you also are proud of your Marine years.
That's true.
Did you actually fight in any of the trenches? Did you actually look down a gun and shoot anyone?
As a matter of fact, is that your question? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
Is that the question?
That is a question.
Good question. I was in the peacetime Marines, 54 to 57. As I say, I extended for a year when it looked as though my battalion would get into combat in the Middle East, and we went to the Middle East and during the Suez War, but that did not come to shooting. In Vietnam, as a civilian, I used my Marine training to walk with troops, to accompany troops in combat, Vietnamese and American Marines, 25th Division Army in Rock Ken. Yes, I was shot at a lot. In fact, I was armed so as not to make people feel they had to protect me, which I'd found was the alternative. Yes, I shot back. Did I shoot anyone? These were not trenches, these were rice paddies. They were in the trenches, in fact, as we advanced on them. I am not aware that I killed anyone, and I'm glad I can say that.
Last call for our two guests. We go to Margate, Florida. Hello.
Hi. I'm calling from Margate. I was looking at one of the stations recently, about a week and a half ago, when someone came up, I think it's a professor, and they were talking about a group of lawyers get together, and they mentioned the president, Donald Rumsfeld, Ashcroft, and Dick Cheney about impeachment. Is there a possibility of that happening?
Bill Kristol, possibility of impeachment?
I don't think so.
Mr. Ellsberg?
Practically speaking, no, but eventually there does come a time, and I hope it's not after months, when some people can be shifted in office and places can be found for them that don't involve making decisions of life and death or war or peace. I have some candidates for that right now, as Bill Kristol knows, and if it's too early now, I hope we don't wait as long to do that as we did in Vietnam, because many American troops would suffer for it.
We have just a minute left. On the issue of Richard Pearl and resigning as chairman, he didn't resign from the board, he just resigned as chairman of the Defense Policy Board. Did he have a conflict of interest?
I don't know much about it, frankly. All I know is what I've read in the press, and I don't think I've read all the press. I'm not sure he had a conflict of interest. He probably shouldn't have agreed. I think he would probably agree with this. That's why he resigned as chairman, to work for Global Crossing at the same time that he was chairman of the Defense Policy Board, when Global Crossing had issues before the Defense Department.
He said in his announcement he's going to give all the money to the families of Iraq who lost family members in this war. What's your reaction to that story?
I'm much more concerned about the bad advice, as I understand it, that he's been giving up till now. So I am happy to see him somewhat removed from that chairmanship. And I want to say, as we come to the end here, that I think, unfortunately, it hasn't come up enough, the disagreement that we did express, and I want to lay it out on the table very strongly. The issues here are not only moral and not only legal. Those are very important, and I think we agree on that. We may see it differently. I think the practical issue of whether this war increases the security of the United States is very important. My opinion, and whether it will protect us from future 9/11s, and whether it will stop proliferation or slow it down. On all three of those counts, I believe this war is extremely ill-advised, despite the fact that Saddam is a tyrant. I think it will increase proliferation. I think that it will increase